So almost exactly 4 years ago, on a Sunday morning in April, I was with my seminary president, Dr. Laleen Rector, at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., participating in an Earth Day service. We were there as part of this Seminary Stewardship Alliance with 11 other seminaries and divinity schools across the country and around the world, seeking to integrate ecological awareness and sustainable practices into the heart of theological education. Before the service, I was standing in the narthex, waiting for things to begin, and noticed Bill McKibben leafing through a bulletin. As most of you know, McKibben is an educator and environmental activist, author of a number of best-selling books. So I walked over, I struck up a conversation, and at one point I asked him, of all the invitations you received to be somewhere on Earth Sunday, why did you accept this one? Faith communities, he said, represent one of the best hopes we have of making a difference on the environment. There is nowhere more important, he said, that I could be this morning than here. Now, when I checked the news that afternoon, I noticed McKibben was the keynote at a 2 o'clock rally on the Mall. So he had at least one other reason to be in D.C. that day. But what he said reflects something of a growing refrain among many in the environmental and scientific communities. In a recent edition of the State of the World report issued by the World Watch Institute, Gary Gardner argues that the religions, which represent over 4/5 of the world's people, must necessarily play a crucial role in addressing the ecological challenges of our time. A 2014 Journal of Science magazine contains an article titled "Pursuit of the Common Good" by authors Partha Dasgupta of Cambridge University and Virabhadran Ramanathan of the University of California. And in it, they write that, quote, finding ways to develop a sustainable relationship with nature requires not only the engagement of scientists and political leaders, but also moral leadership that religious institutions are uniquely in a position to offer. In a separate article, Ramanathan is quoted as saying, 8 decades of research on the natural and social science aspects of environmental changes has led us to the doorsteps of moral leaders of religions to rescue humanity from climate change and a host of other environmental crises. So I'm really looking forward to engaging you all in conversation today. In particular, to reflect on what you make of this appeal to you, religious leaders. And by religious leaders, I mean not just the professional clerics, but all of you who activate and are activated by your faith tradition. How might our respective traditions provide resources of wisdom, perspective, and hope for the sake of the good of our common planetary home? So my aim is to start off by offering some thoughts on the roles of religions, and in particular, I'm going to be recommending the concept of resilience as an orienting focus. First, let's be clear, and I think most everyone in this room knows, but let's be clear again just about how urgent and formidable the challenges are. Over a decade ago, Nobel Prize-winning atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen coined the term Anthropocene to suggest that we are living in a new geologic era. Human activities from the industrial age onward, he argued, have replaced natural processes as the dominant geological force impacting the Earth and its many interconnected systems. The term has gained acceptance among not just geologists, but among others in the scientific community, as evidence mounts by the day that we humans, the anthropoi, are engaged in what Rob Nixon calls high-speed planetary modification. Climate change, of course, is the most prominent mark of the Anthropocene. Climatologist James Hansen, I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work, formerly at NASA, now a professor at Columbia University, has directed public attention to the number of carbon dioxide parts per million in the atmosphere. The average level that produced the past 10,000 years of relative climatic stability, he says, was around 275 parts per million. For that whole period of time, up until very recently, the temperature on average barely budged, averaging somewhere between 58 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit worldwide. So this was the climate that produced the weather that nurtured the tree under which the Buddha sat. The land Moses led his people to flowing with milk and honey. The grains Jesus plucked from the fields, and the water the Prophet Muhammad insisted believers must share with the thirsty, lest they sin against Allah. Since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, that number of CO2 parts per million has increased steadily and thus far has raised the temperature of the planet more than 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. That itself has caused the climatic changes that are becoming everyday news around the world. Massive increases in oceanic thunderheads, generating supercells leading to more and more hurricanes. Enormous lightning strikes causing mega fire events worldwide, extended drought seasons, the melting of the ice caps far quicker than scientists had predicted even a decade ago, and the increase in erratic weather events, which prompted Hunter Lovins a few years ago to propose that we replace global warming with global weirding. In 2008, Hansen published a paper in which he argued that 350 parts per million, you know this number, right? 350 parts per million is the number we can reach before we do irreparable harm to the biosphere. Now, often when I lecture on this, I'll stop and I'll ask where folks think we are now. My guess is most in this room know. I typically get answers of 340, low 300s. As most of you know, the number we're presently at on global average is around 400 and rising. Even more, what many in the scientific community are increasingly concerned about are a series of negative feedback loops that are already starting to kick in. So with the melting of the ice caps, there's far more ocean area on the Earth, reflecting the sun back out towards space with greater intensity, only to be trapped under a thickening blanket of CO2. With the warming of the frozen tundras, large pockets of methane are being released, escalating the pace of warming. And as the Earth warms, the natural mechanisms of trapping carbon, trees, vegetation, healthy soils, are becoming less effective in doing their job. A recent synthesis report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, states that apart from concerted worldwide action to cut emissions 40 to 70% by 2050, and thank God that we are starting to see action out of the Paris Agreement, imperfect as it is, but apart from concerted action, subsequent warming will lead to substantial species extinction, global and regional food insecurity, consequential constraints on common human activities, and limited potential for adaptation in many cases. Now, and this is an important point, even if we succeed in meeting identified targets, we will have already created an enormous amount of biosphere damage. We have to come to that realization. As Bill McKibben writes in his book, Earth, spelled E-A-A-R-T-H, to reflect the reality that we no longer live on the same planet as our ancestors. Quote, "We're like the guy who smoked for 40 years and then had a stroke. Even if we were to completely stop smoking today, we'd be left with a side of our body that doesn't quite work the same anymore." So this is the tough new planet we already live on. You know, I used to think that apocalyptic scenarios were just the domain of religious folks, right? My goodness, it's the scientists today who bear the kind of tidings of bad news traditionally reserved for the fire and brimstone preachers. So here again is the question I want to engage you with today, stated a bit differently. What are the contributions of the religions in the age of the Anthropocene? Now, I realize there's some disagreement about future scenarios and even present realities, but let's assume, and I'm assuming in this room, let's assume that that we are in fact living on a tough new planet. And let's assume that the biospheric changes to come will make it an even tougher planet. Let's begin there. If so, amidst the contributions of doctors and lawyers and engineers and architects and economists and more, what might the leaders within our faith traditions and the traditions themselves have to contribute? So again, I want to suggest resiliency as an orienting focus. In an age of unprecedented terrestrial change, the religions are called upon to dig deep into ancient wisdoms and practices, critically reformed for a new era in order to nurture a more resilient faith. Sustainability, of course, has been the primary focus for the last 4 to 5 decades. Like any overused word, it has so many meanings, perhaps as to be meaningless, but one of the recurrent emphases is the affirmation that something is sustainable to the extent that it fosters the long-term continuation of some present set of goods. So one common definition of sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that we discard sustainability as an orienting concern. Certainly the mandate to sustain life and certain ways of life from generation to generation is central to all the world's religious traditions. In 2003, when Mary Evelyn Tucker, director of the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, published Worldly Wonder, Religions Enter Their Ecological Phase, she was summing up all of the incredibly important work that has been accomplished within the religions around the concept of sustainability, to revision our role as citizens of the universe, she wrote, and to reinvent our niche as members of the Earth community. It has meant reading sacred scriptures and religious traditions anew. It has meant seeking out resources that affirm the intrinsic and not just instrumental goodness of the natural world. And we have seen creative grassroots initiatives represented by many of you in this room among faith communities worldwide, focusing on sustaining the environment for future generations. But again, here's the deal. The world as we have known it has already changed. In fact, quite drastically. From an evolutionary perspective, that's always been the case. Even from a historical perspective, as Jared Diamond's work on civilizational collapse shows, human societies have repeatedly declined or died out because they overshot and overused natural resources. But what's new is the global breadth and destructive depth of the changes we have wielded upon the earth. And so, if this is true, then resilience really is a more realistic and relevant focus. William Rees, professor in the School of Community and Regional Planning at the University of British Columbia, better known as a co-originator of the ecological footprint analysis, defines resilience as the capacity of a system to withstand disturbance while still retaining its fundamental structure, function, and internal feedbacks. In the field of psychology, personal resilience is characterized by an individual's ability to properly adapt to stress and adversity. So I'm proposing that the orienting focus for religious contributions on a tough new planet is the formation and promotion of resilient faith. So for the rest of my time, I want to offer a set of defining characteristics and proposals about what resilient faith may include, but with one important quick caveat. I've been speaking about the religions, and in some ways I'm going to continue to do so, as if they are a monolithic cultural phenomenon, each of them performing a similar role within varied social contexts. Well, that's just simply not the case. That's a whole other conversation. But let me just say that what I believe will be needed in the age of the Anthropocene are not just general religious frameworks, but the very particular, unique, and internally diverse contributions of each religious tradition. So let me decenter what I'm saying by making clear I am a Protestant Christian, an ordained minister in the United Methodist Church, ecumenically educated, but like all of us, very much limited in my perspective and shaped by my social vocation. So I offer up my thoughts on resilient faith in order to invite you to contribute your insights rooted in your own particular religious tradition. So I've got 5 points. I had more, but 5 is enough. First, resilient faith speaks hard truths. Religious traditions bear within them resources to name and describe human intractability. We speak the language of sin, estrangement, folly, greed, sloth, transgression, evil. I mean, how else are we to speak of the worldwide decimation of biological diversity? The toxic contamination of waters and air, the blowing apart of mountain ranges formed over tens of millions of years, if not with such language.
Yes.
I mean, calling them lapses in judgment or economic externalities doesn't really quite get at it. You know, I hear the frustration from some in the scientific community. How is it possible that so many people can deny the basic evidence? Here, religious insights into human capacities for self-deception and willful ignorance may be helpful. Similarly, I suspect the Augustinian view, found in a variety of traditions, though expressed in different ways, that sin begins in freedom, leads to habit, and ends in bondage, likely describes well what many of us experience in being bound up in systems of production, consumption, and distribution, livelihood, and lifestyle that we know full well are harmful, but from which it is difficult to imagine truly being freed. That said, the religions, though certainly embedded within the structures of the status quo, nevertheless possess the kind of internal freedom, the prophetic freedom to raise questions about everything from global trade agreements to the transnational influence of the energy industry to the personal decisions of individuals regarding consumption. Maybe sustainability here is too nice. I realize where I'm saying that. Resilient faith has a more critical edge. We can and we should draw upon our traditions to speak hard truths. Second, resilient faith embraces difficult feelings. This is a dynamic I have to account for in the classroom. You know, to assign an essay by someone like famed oceanographer Dr. Sylvia Earle, who tells us that the oceans are dying because of pollution, overfishing, and acidification, is to invite a range of emotions into the classroom. Sadness, anger, fear, insecurity. Information of this sort, and I can see you're a room who knows this information. As I tell it again, you just see the energy of the room and the faces, right? Well, this generates effective responses, existential reflection that can't simply be ignored for the students or, frankly, for the instructor. Again, the religions possess resources here that are capable of permitting, of bearing up, of expressing deep human angst. Resources which perhaps may not be found anywhere else. Rituals of lament, practices of confession and penitence, disciplines that allow us to be present and not to flee when it all feels too overwhelming. You know, the mystical traditions speak of something like the cloud of unknowing or the dark night of the soul, affirming that we will not find salvation, enlightenment, apart from facing into these difficult spaces. 2 years ago this spring, I was invited to speak to a gathering of religious leaders in western South Dakota about issues of the faith and the environment. Donna and Dick Fisher, alums of Hamline, were both there. At one point, I invited those gathered to share how they are already experiencing changes to their landscape. With tears in his eyes, one man spoke of the ranching communities he serves, which had been devastated by the unexpected early October blizzard that killed as many as 100,000 livestock in the western Dakotas. A Lakota woman spoke with deep anger in her voice about the proposed Keystone XL pipeline that, had it been constructed, would have run alongside several Native American reservations and directly over the Ogallala Aquifer. The wisdom, again, from the mystics, from each of our traditions, is that it is precisely by attending to that which is most difficult, by pressing toward the pain and the anguish, that new ways forward, which could not have been imagined otherwise, begin to emerge. So resilient faith embraces the revelatory and potentially liberatory nature of difficult feelings. Third, resilient faith confronts questions of theodicy with care. In the wake of every major disaster, the Pompeii volcano, the Black Plague, the Lisbon earthquake, the Chicago fire, the Galveston, Texas hurricane, in the wake of disaster, questions inevitably arise about the will of God, about the presence or the absence of the divine in the midst of evil, and about human culpability and blame. These are the questions that those of you who are religious leaders are called upon to speak to in such times. How could God allow so many innocent to die? What sins did we commit to deserve God's wrath? Faith that is resilient does not avoid dealing with such questions. And in fact, religious leaders and communities must do so today. I would propose by acknowledging that what are often called acts of God are increasingly related to human activity. But these are questions that must be wrestled with very carefully. You all remember, I'm sure, the words of the televangelist following a national disaster. Quote, "I really believe that the pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians at ACLU, People for the American Way, all of them who have tried to secularize America, I point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen." With words like these, misguided, dangerous religious leaders add to the violence caused by a tsunami, a massive flood, a devastating drought, often harming yet again those who are already suffering. And so wise religious leaders on a tough new planet will have to address these questions, but in ways that avoid easy scapegoating, ultimately, I would argue, by being resilient enough to live with far more ambiguity in the coming years than certainty. Fourth, resilient faith stands with the poor and the oppressed. At present, it is those who are already victimized by structures and attitudes of racism, sexism, classism. It is the poor, the young, the elderly, people of color, in particular from impoverished countries, those who have contributed the least to the problem of overconsumption. These are the populations most affected today by droughts, heat waves, the flooding of coastal cities, and more. You remember when Hurricane Katrina slammed into the Gulf Coast region, to just give one example. There were clear demographic differences between the areas that experienced catastrophic damage and those that remained relatively untouched. As sociologist John Logan's research revealed, the population of the damaged areas was nearly half black, primarily living in rental housing and disproportionately below the poverty line. One of the most heart-wrenching stories is of the men who were left in jail with water up to their necks, abandoned for over 3 days with no food, no drinkable water, and no idea if anyone would come to their rescue. So it's possible, and those of us who are white in this room should hear this clearly, myself included. It is possible to be completely devoted to the cause of sustainability, and if we are privileged, at the same time to completely ignore race, class, and more. The religions, while in no way immune here, and still in deep need of reformation, do at least contain strands within each of them that point toward a world in which the poor are no longer forgotten and equality reigns among all. Resilient faith, then, must be interdisciplinary at the theoretical level, and intersectional on the ground in seeking to connect environmental struggles with other movements for justice. In fact, resilient faith will go beyond sustainability only by standing with, among, and for the poor and oppressed. Fifth and finally, resilient faith bears witness to hope. I know I took a while to get here. I suspect that this is a primary reason scientists like Ramanathan and Dasgupta are turning today to the religions. Religions take in the depths, but are not overcome. There is this quality found in each religion, though expressed in different ways. It is the capacity to assume a rigorously realistic stance, while at the same time uttering, amidst the very worst of it, nevertheless. We see it in the daily pursuit of enlightenment, despite the banality, in spite of the constant distractions and seemingly endless failures of returning to breath, to focus, to presence. It is the utter absurdity of proclaiming belief in resurrection in the face of so many crucifixions. It is the story of the rabbis in Auschwitz putting God on trial, finding God guilty, and then proceeding to observe the evening prayers. Resilience. As the poet writes, after the final no, there comes a yes. And on that yes, the future world depends. If UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon is right, that humanity has never faced a greater challenge than anthropogenic climate change, then this capacity contained within the world's religions to utter nevertheless, yes, will be our most vital contribution. The religions are equipped, filled, overflowing with an abundance of tools well suited to assisting in the conversion of mindsets away from individual self-interest toward a more global good. Religions have honed the art of rapidly changing personal behaviors and transforming social structures. Again, there is no doubt that the religions, too, still need to be converted to a more thoroughgoing ecological perspective. But as ethicist Larry Rasmussen affirms, we're not starting from scratch. Religious traditions of transformation are already at hand, he writes, for working at the foundations of human character and conduct, with the moral authority to shape lives both inwardly and outwardly. Traditions rooted in patterns of death and renewal, birth and rebirth, and able to sustain ways of life marked by rites of passage and close, intimate community. Perhaps one place to ground our hope for the earth, for our future, will flow from these rituals and practices of our faith. When you consider it, the basic elements are all there. Stone, table, bread, wine, soil, the tree of life, breath, oil, water. In turning to the elements of our religious practices, to receive from them again the gifts of the earth, gifts from the divine, gifts from the unfolding cosmos, I believe we find the nourishment and the resilience to bear hope. In September of 2014, over 200 religious and spiritual leaders from around the world gathered in New York City for a Religions of the Earth conference. I'm going to conclude by sharing words from one of the opening speakers. So why are we here? Well, this climate crisis has thus far proven to be insoluble for our political leaders. It's also clear that it's not going to come from economic and business solutions alone either. So where's it going to come from? We have a mighty and an important role to play, along other partners in the movement. Each of us come from faith traditions that claim thousands, if not millions, of faithful community people from all over the world. And this is important. It cannot be said more strongly and more often. All our faith traditions, without exception, teach reverence for the earth and its magnificently diverse ecosystems. We need to ask hard questions of ourselves. We need to seek guidance from our deep teachings and from one another, and we need to find a new way forward. We need to send a message out that can give inspiration and hope, to give a story to those who are struggling. We need our political leaders to realize how many of us there are, how many we represent, what kinds of questions we're asking, and the kinds of demands that we will not let up on. They need to know that we are not backing down, that we will back up our arguments with moral support, with theological arguments, with keen dreams, with ancient wisdom, with human love and perseverance, and we will show them that our communities are ready to change the course of human, I would add, biospheric history. That sounds a lot like resilient to me.